Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Humm. I'm one of the Dialogue Doctor Coaches, and I am here today with Dixie Williams. Dixie, can you tell us a little about yourself and the piece we're going to work on today?
Well, I'm a new writer, and I just got an idea to write a story when my father died about their love story. And so I began this book, and it's totally nothing like what I thought it was going to be.
I feel like that's always the way when we sit down to start a project. What we think it's going to be doesn't always turn be what it turns out to be. But it's nice that you're doing it kind of as a tribute to your father.
The next one will probably be more about him, but
That's
I guess
okay.
we have to, that's just the journey we take, right?
That's right. That's right. It doesn't really matter where the story's origin is, just how it comes out. So, do you want to tell us a little bit about kind of what this scene does in your story and what you're hoping to get out of today?
Well, this scene is the big climactic football scene where the big trauma is that she accidentally killed her brother, and it changed her whole family dynamics with her mom and her dad, and of course her brother because he was not here anymore. So
So, this
yes,
is a flashback scene.
right. When
Okay.
she was a teenager in high school, and now she's 40. So,
Okay. So, big kind of pivotal, um, I mean, losing a family member in any capacity at a young age is very impactful in your life, but then to also feel responsible for the death actually can be very traumatic. And then, of course, how it changes and influences the whole family dynamic is really important. So, thank you for sharing this scene. As I was going through this scene, my big question for you is, as we're reading the scene, we're seeing it from Daisy's point of view. Daisy's your main character, your main vehicle, and we're seeing it from her point of view. Are we seeing it through Daisy's eyes as a teenager, or are we seeing it through Daisy's 40-year-old self remembering the scene from when she was a teenager?
oh, good question. Um, yeah, I probably wrote it more of when she was a teenager.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay, I absolutely could tell that's the direction that you wanted to go. And I think from because of what she's experiencing, I think from a reader's experience, that's the right direction to go.
Oh, okay, good.
So a lot of the edits that I have for you today are helping you pull that 40 something mindset out of the scene so that we're experiencing the scene through a teenager's eyes and
Mm,
not through the eyes of an adult who has had 25 plus years to process this event, right? We have a as adults, we look back on our childhood. Most adults, not every adult, but a lot of adults will go back and we'll look at our childhood and we'll try to understand what happened. We'll explain our behaviors. We'll have thought processes that help us explain other people's behavior. And there was a lot of that in this scene, which takes away from the real raw emotion of the scene. So, we're
mm,
going to talk a little bit today about how you can pull back on the adult thinking and translate it into the way teenagers talk and the way that teenagers focus so that you can really get to that really big emotional impact of the
mm,
scene and really, because what you want your readers to feel here is the pain and the anguish that she's feeling, first of all, because her brother is, we, we assume that he's dead or dying at the like in the middle part of the scene, but we don't actually know. I guess we know because it's a flashback. She talks about it a lot in the other parts of the story. But we want our readers to forget that we know what happens at the end. We want them to see this happening real time in her eyes. So pulling back some of those adult moments really will help us kind of zoom in on the action. So,
Okay, great.
all right, enough talk. Let's do some show here. Because, we always say show, don't tell, right? I know that's not what we actually mean, but I have to keep talking while I find the
That
page
was
that I want to
funny.
share. I do love a good pun. Why can I not find? I have like 4,000 things that I can share, but the one thing that I want to share, there it is. One of these days, I'm going to do one of these recordings and I'm just going to know how to share the screen and I won't have to talk about it. Surprised Jeff doesn't get 100 comments like, oh my gosh, Laura just learned to use your technology.
I know, no
Okay.
worries.
So you can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So I divided your scene kind of into three, maybe four parts. We've got the before, the during, and the after. I might have put it in two durings. I might have done during A and during B. I'm not sure. I can't remember. Um, this setup is really great because what it does, it's like when you're writing a full story, a full novel, you usually want to tell your readers the world before, the climactic events, and the world after, right? Like it just makes for really good storytelling. So you've done a really great job in this sectioning out of how the story comes about. What
Mhm.
I want to see a little bit more in the before is really setting the stage. You had said, as you were kind of talking about this being the big reveal, the big pivotal moment in your story that changes the trajectory of her whole life. That's coming from a couple of places. It's changing her family dynamics. It's giving her the opportunity to meet the person who's going to be her future spouse, right? Like it's kind of all of the worlds coming together. Spoiler alert there, she meets her future spouse at the end of this.
Mhm.
Um, but one of the things that we need to see is the relationships that she had with her mom and her dad and her brother before this big event. So, would you say that they were one big happy family before the event? Or would you say there's a little trouble there already?
They were mostly happy except, she had always felt that the mom, favored the son and that she kind of always bothered her, because her mom was more like, organized and she was kind of like a, energetic, spontaneous person, and it was almost like she was just a little bit extra for her maybe.
Okay.
And the son actually more, helped the mom, uh, and the mom was kind of like OCD with cleaning, and the girl was always doing stuff and, kind of messing stuff up. And then the father was in the military, so she related more to the father, but the father was away a lot when she was growing up.
Okay.
So this is when the first year they're able to live in the same place, and he's promised her, that she'll never have to move again. And so it's supposed to be this great, great year, like that's gonna be, the best year of her life, and it ends up being the worst year of her life that changes everything.
Okay. So I love that detail of the story where they're a family struggling, dad's home for the first time. She's always felt that mom kind of resents her a little bit and just idolizes her older brother. That is a very common family dynamic that we see in literature, we see in movies, we hear about all the time. Many people have, if it's not their family story, they know someone who has a family story like that. Sibling rivalry is a very, very common thing, whether it actually exists or it's the perception of the children. doesn't actually matter. We all know somebody who feels like, well, mom liked you better than me, right? Like that's really common. In your before section, I want to see that. Right now, you start your before section with Daisy having this great, Mom, this is the best Christmas dinner you've ever cooked. And Aunt Sarah, your macaroni and cheese, chef's kiss. And then she starts talking about the game, right? You're
I
starting,
actually had it before and I took it out. I
you,
should have kept it. I had it where, the brother gave her a locket,
mhm, yeah,
and it showed how close they were, or is that in
yep.
there?
Nope, that's not in there, but she talks about the locket later. And the way that you bring in the locket is great. What I'd like to see here is, Mom, this is the best Christmas dinner you've ever cooked. Mom ignores her and says, um, Drew, Drew, I made your favorite kind of mashed potatoes. Are you sure you don't want a second helping? Right?
Mm,
So we're seeing the fact that she's doing everything that she can to connect with her mother, and her mother is pulling away from her. That
okay,
just dynamic of just that one exchange between parents sets the stage for what the rest of the scene is going to be, right?
mhm,
Because right now we see her as this energetic, excited child in this family. She makes this big statement. Can we clean up later? It's time for the big game, right? Like everybody's getting up from the table, and then no one responds to her. We've got now two large paragraphs of prose before the next person who speaks, and the next person who speaks is Aunt Sarah. We still don't hear from the mom. And it's okay that we don't hear from the mom to Daisy, but we need to show that the mom is actively disengaging, or it's
okay,
Daisy's perception that the mom is disengaging from her.
I like that,
Because we want to feel what Daisy's feeling in this moment, right?
okay,
Now, you make a lot of comments in this scene about Daisy's finally old enough to play in this game. And there are lots of details about like how important this game is to her and how important it is to the family. But I'm having a hard time kind of understanding who all is in this scene. This is a very common thing, especially for new writers, when we have large casts, right? You've got mom and dad and Drew and Daisy, and now we know we have Aunt Sarah, and we have all the cousins and all the adults.
yeah,
And that's okay, right? Like we don't need to know every person at the start. You don't need to give the laundry list, right? But it's okay to give us a couple of more exchanges, right? Instead of this happening as they're getting up from the table, maybe the first thing we hear is Daisy looking at Drew and going, "What time do you think Mom's going to let us get up from the table to play the game, right? Game time is at 3 o'clock." And then Drew can be like, Daisy, I know this is your first year, but calm down. We'll get to it when we get to it. And she can say something like, you don't even want to play anyway. You've been able to play for however many years, and this is my turn. This is my first year, right?
mm,
And then um, he can say something about, the rules, you have to be X number of years old. Because the way we're talking about it right now, I don't have any framework for how old anyone in the scene is,
mhm,
which matters, but it doesn't matter. When you aren't giving the signposts for what we are supposed to be seeing, you leave it to the reader's imagination. I saw her at about 10 years old because in my
mm,
mind, old enough to play is about 10.
Okay.
I don't
Yeah.
know where that came from for me, but in my mind, that's what it was. And then there are places later where other people are reinforcing this idea that, oh, it's your first year, you're finally old enough. She says something about they'll see that I'm not a baby anymore. And that
Yeah.
transition between I'm not a baby tends to happen around 5, 6, or 7. So I
Mhm.
first thought 10, and then I thought 5 or 6, but then in the after scene, when she meets this boy, I'm like, oh, wait, she's not 10. She's
Mm.
right. Like, so giving us a little bit of that understanding of the age of her, the age of her brother, what the family dynamics are like, are going to orient us and get us more ready to be in the moment of the scene. Now, I'm not saying add 2 paragraphs of prose that are like, Daisy turned 14 this year and it was the first year she could no, put it in a conversation, right? Like
Yeah.
how many times have we like waited to be old enough for something and it's the only thing that we talk about? I think about I have a friend whose daughter is just old enough to get her driver's license. And there's a lot of conversations about when I actually get my license, now that I'm old enough to get my license. And right, like everything as a teenager or a younger person, we have a tendency to really focus on the thing that's right in front of us, and it is all consuming. You have
That's a
children,
good point. Maybe I'll make it more like she's played before, but this is finally the year she feels she's old enough to be competition, maybe. Because that makes sense that she would have been able to play before because, I mean, it's not professional or anything.
right? Well,
But
I mean,
maybe I'll more say that, it's she feels like she's actually old enough to be, I don't
or
know, maybe something like that?
Yeah, I think that works really great. You've got this idea that her father is playing for the first time, and maybe she and her father have been outside every day for 2 weeks throwing the ball and working on her plays and her
Oh,
catches. And
that's good,
right,
yeah.
like, so this idea that we're seeing that even though the mom hasn't been very warm to Daisy, her father, who like kind of comes to her rescue a little bit later, is, you know, is all about her playing. And maybe Daisy says something to her brother like, well, you're just mad that dad's been playing outside. Dad's been coaching me and hasn't been coaching you. And Drew can say something like, I don't even really like football. I just like running track. I wouldn't be playing in this game if dad wasn't making me, right? Like, and
Mm,
now with that conversation that's happening between 2 teenagers, you're getting a full picture of what's
and that
happening.
and that's really good too because at the end of the story, like, all her life, she's felt guilty, and at the end, Red actually tells her that he has felt guilty because he's the one who made him play, and, that he wasn't gonna play because the mom didn't want him to play, but he was like, "No, you need to play." So
Right,
that's a good conversation to have, yeah.
right. And it gives us just a little bit more of an understanding of the camaraderie that Daisy and Drew have with each other because
Mhm,
we want to feel the loss. We have to know Drew to
mhm.
understand what Daisy's loss is. Yes, we understand that losing a sibling is a big traumatic event in a child's life, but if we as the reader don't love Drew, it's
Yeah.
much harder to see the impact of that. So if
Well, I
you
have a scene earlier of how close they are and how he's kind of protecting her against the mother's, kind of like
Mhm,
negligence, emotional negligence. And he knows that he's the favorite and he very much like involves her, yet doesn't offend the mom. Like that
mhm.
scene is like earlier, but
Excellent.
I like
Do it
this.
here again. So
Yeah.
here's the thing about a scene that sometimes we as writers and editors forget. Just because we've written it before doesn't mean our readers remember it
Mhm.
before. what triggers the memory of, oh, yeah, I remember when this happened before between Drew and Daisy and their mom, is when you see it again here. And
Mm.
Daisy's like, oh, this always happens. You talk to her. Or Daisy and the mom start getting into a fight. The mom starts picking on her about, like, you shouldn't even be playing this. You should be practicing your cheers on the side. And Daisy's like, Mom, I told you I don't even want to be a cheerleader. And Drew steps in, like puts his hand on Daisy's arm and is like, Mom, I think it's really good for Daisy to do this. Like, football is really about strength and cheerleading's about strength. This is going to be a good thing. Like whatever it is that he does to like put
Mhm.
everybody at ease, let us see that in this scene again,
Okay.
because it's going to help the reader remember that we felt all those great emotions between the two of them in the earlier scene, and it's just going to warm us to him a little bit faster. That recollection of putting everything that you need into a scene means that if you have a reader who had to put down the book and it's been 2 weeks before they've picked it up again, I mean, how many times has that happened, right? Like we fall in love with a book, we're so excited to read it, but then something happens and life gets in the way and we can't pick that book up again for another couple of weeks. We're not going to start back at the beginning to remember every chapter. We're going to pick up wherever our bookmark is or wherever our like Kindle opens back up to, right? And we're going to pick up. So we want to encase everything we need into one scene. You don't want to rehash other things, but giving us that, and it doesn't have to be paragraphs and paragraphs. It can literally just be 2 or 3 exchanges that are going to help us remember, oh, yeah, Drew's the peacemaker. Mom and Daisy are kind of at odds with each other. Mom doesn't really enjoy the kind of child that Daisy's growing up to be, but right, like give us that
Yeah, that's great.
orientation.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then you can also add Red, the dad, into it, right? The mom
Mhm.
starts getting on to Daisy, and dad's like, this is my first year home. Of course she's going to play. I'd get you out there playing if I could, right? Like, and then you don't need the pros to tell us that this is Red's first year, right? You've
Right.
got the conversation. Maybe Joey, the cousin who's Drew's age, is like, yeah, Uncle Red, it's so great that you're back this year. I can't wait to show you everything I do. Like, I'm star of my high school football team, and you just wait, like those
Oh, yeah, I
kinds of
like that.
things.
Yeah.
If you put that in conversation instead of in prose, it allows us to see the family dynamics without having to be told all of the things. So you'll notice in the margins here, I have a lot of comments that are just about what I was thinking as I was reading the scene. One of the
Mm.
big things about editing for yourself is you have to understand what you know as an author and what the reader actually knows. So, what I did in here is I just made a couple of notes for you. I'm not going to read through all of them because we talked about the solution for it, but this can kind of help you see how we got to that solution. So I don't know what year it is. I don't know how old Daisy is. We talked about that a little bit. This is a flashback, so we really have to do a good job of setting the stage for that understanding. Um, we talked about the no one respondings. So she says here she was finally old enough to play. This is in the prose. And then we have the women and Uncle Pete are helping to clean up. Aunt Sarah had trained him well. Aunt Sarah training him well is a very grown-up observation. Children
Mm.
don't usually think those kinds of things. She was ready for the first annual football game at this house. Red retired from the military. Sarah's family lives there. They're the only cousins here. So you're giving us these little pieces of information, but what you've done is you've given me a puzzle that I have to put together. I'm trying to figure out who all of these people are in the situation. Whereas if you move the scene back about 10 minutes and Drew is sitting next to Daisy. The two of them start talking. They're elbowing each other. And then Red speaks up from across the table to join into that conversation. And then he turns to Lily, who's sitting right next to him. Now you're orienting the reader from two people to three people to four people. And then we hear from Aunt Sarah, and then we hear from her husband, and then Joey chimes in, and you're giving us who's at the table through
Mm,
Daisy's perspective. So we're seeing it from her eyes because children have a tendency to see only what's in front of them or only what's coming at them, right? So even
mhm,
though she's at a table with her mother and her father and her brother and her cousins and her aunt and her uncle and whomever else is there, um, we don't need that laundry list at the beginning. The conversation, and we've all been at a table where there are a lot of people. Conversations tend to start small, and then other people gather in until the whole table's talking about the same thing. By
mm,
building it out like that, you take away the need for all of this prose because you
mm,
can put it all into the conversation. So when they get up from the table, it's a nice, clean transition. They get up from the table, Aunt Sarah and Lily and Uncle
Pete.
Pete go into the kitchen with the plates. The kids all go outside. Red says, I'll be outside in a minute. I'll bring the ball. Right? Nice, clean ending to that part of the scene. So the next part of the scene that picks up on the football field starts immediately with the game. Okay.
Mm.
I'm going to protect the big reveal in your scene and jump to what happens after we find out that he's dead. But before we transition to that, do you have any other questions about anything I've said about the front part of this scene and how I kind of got to put it in the conversation?
I don't think so. I like what you said. I've written this about 3 times, and a couple of my writes back then had more of what you're saying, but then and I think I was just excited to get to the action maybe, and that's probably why.
Absolutely. And there's a thing that happens when we try to self-edit when we can't necessarily figure out what's not working in the scene. We
Yeah.
have a tendency to put what we've written aside and try again from a
Mhm,
different perspective or a different angle. And sometimes when we rewrite the scene, we stumble on something that works and it feels good to us. But sometimes, if we don't know what wasn't working the first time in our new draft, we either recreate the same problem from a different perspective or we create a new problem. So the diagnostics in the edit can be just as important as the edits themselves. And my recommendation for you, if you're trying to self-edit or if you're in a place where you're not sure what's not working, you just know you're not connecting, I
mhm,
would ask yourself, what is it that you feel like you're missing? What I felt like I was missing in this scene was an understanding of the family dynamics. I understood that this game was really important. I understood that the mom didn't want her to play. I understood that Drew didn't want to play, that dad was um, there for the first time, and that Aunt Sarah was very compassionate for Daisy. But I
yeah,
was missing the fact that Lily and Daisy had a very frustrating mother-daughter relationship. I
mm,
was missing the fact that Drew was kind of the favorite child. There's some
mm,
language in here where he talks to the mom and is like, Mom, are you sure that you want me to play? I don't have to play, right? And some of that language didn't feel very authentic to a teenage boy, but it
mm,
did what you were trying to do in this understanding of like, he's the peacemaker. So it
yeah,
could be that like the pieces are there, but the big piece that was missing wasn't in there. So if you can't diagnose what's missing, it's hard to figure out how to fix it. So,
And he's in his 20s, by the way, like, he's like a
oh,
he's older than her. He's like, let's see, she was 5 when he was in 5th grade. What is that? Um,
okay. So he's about 5 years older than her. If
that's it,
he,
okay.
yeah. I mean, if she was 5, she was probably in kindergarten, so maybe 6 years. Um,
Mhm.
but that's an important distinction for us to know because if he's 20, is he living at home
See,
still?
I had said it before, but you're right, I need to say it again.
Right. Like, help
Yeah.
us because, and here's the other thing. Sometimes when we're reading and we get to a chapter that really hits us really hard, we'll tell someone else, hey, read this chapter with me. You don't have to read the whole book, but this chapter, I really connected with it. Read it. Or, if you get to a place in your author journey where you're doing book readings, you're going to have to pick a scene from a book, a scene like this that's such a pivotal moment in development. Could be read in a situation like that. You want to make sure everything that we need to know is in here. Because there's
Mm,
also a big difference between um, losing a child at 15 and losing a child at 20, right? The loss of a child is always, always crushing, changes the whole family. But 15 and 20 is a big difference in the what ifs and what are they missing, right? When you lose a child at 15, they're never going to drive a car, they're never going to graduate from high school, they're never going to grow up and get married and fall in love. When you lose a child at 20, it's they're never going to graduate from college, they're never going to get married. Like the what ifs start at a really different place. So the impact of that. Additionally, the further distance you have between Drew and Daisy in age and where he lives means that the dynamics in the family are very different. If he's not living at home, maybe he's just home for college, from college. Daisy and her mom have been having this confrontation for months with basically just the two of them because Red's not always home, right? Like if he's been gone, she hasn't had that his protection in a semester or however long it's been, which means that the tensions are even worse. So Drew has to work even harder to bring it down.
mm,
Oftentimes, when we're writing a story that has a big flashback like this, we think about the impact the moment we're flashing back to has on our character's development in our current timeline. But sometimes we have to go back a little bit further and understand the full dynamics of the family, because what you're doing when you're doing a flashback is you're writing a scene at a different point in time with a different POV vehicle character. You have
yeah,
to put yourself in the understanding of what that character is experiencing so that we can create the moment that then creates who your main vehicle character is in your main timeline. So it's almost like you're creating a whole different story within a story, and that
mm,
needs its own character development. It needs its own character arc. It needs its own before and after, which again, you've done really well in the creation of the story. I just need a little bit more to anchor myself because we need to understand how we get to the change that happens in the family that we see later.
mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, this is great.
Okay.
Another reason I think it's kind of, um, disconnected too is, I started writing this story, like, 2 years ago, and I only wrote certain scenes that I knew were gonna happen and that I was
Mm-hmm.
really excited about, and this was one of them. So this
Yep.
I edited it, but it was originally written, like, 2 years ago, and I've learned a lot more for writing, but it's hard to edit something from, when you're totally different. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
So this
Absolutely. And
is, like, great. I'm so glad you're doing this.
yeah, absolutely. And I love that you bring that up, that as you grow as a writer, um, I'm not a writer, I'm an editor, but I do write technical work for my day job for my master's program that I did. I did a lot of technical writing for that, as most people in a master's program do, right? And I have that same thing when I go back to something that I wrote 2 years ago, or even sometimes 2 months ago. I read it and I'm like, wait, this is
Yeah,
all wrong. How did I do that? Because as you learn so much more when you go back to those earlier things, you see the things that you want. The problem is that sometimes we see so many things, we don't really know where to
yeah.
start.
'Cause I could
So,
do I edited the, football game fine,
mhm,
and I feel like the meeting, better, but that beginning, I was
yeah.
so, like, discombobulated about it, so this is great what you said.
Good, good. Yeah. So I would just say start at the dinner table, help us orient to who everybody is, let us really see the dynamics, and then get them all outside really quickly. I'm going to skip, like I said, I'm going to skip through the game itself. We'll save your reveal. And then let's talk about the after. Okay. So there's a problem, and Drew gets hurt, and the ambulance has been called, and Lily, who's Daisy's mom, is blaming Daisy, and Daisy just has to get away. Again, you've got Daisy at 14, 15 years old. Is that right?
Yeah,
Okay.
yep.
Okay.
10th grade, I think.
Okay. Um, so you've got her running away, and you have her saying she had to leave. She couldn't take seeing her mom like this, especially since it was her fault. And then she's kind of processing some of the stuff that she experienced in the game. There was a bee, and now she hates bees, and she never wants to see another one for the rest of her life. And Red looks up and says, Daisy, where are you going? But he wouldn't leave Lily's side. Daisy ran toward the street. Now,
And I just was gonna tell you one thing. When he met Lily, she was kind of this, like, tortured soul, like, she told him about her, mom who was verbally abusive, and at the end of the meeting, he was like, "I will protect her forever, no matter who I have to," you know.
perfect. But Daisy doesn't know any of that.
Mhm,
So by saying, but he wouldn't leave Lily's side, you're putting somebody else's perspective into the scene. We have to keep it all from Daisy's perspective, right? And we want to take all of those adult thoughts out of the scene. So Daisy had to get away. She started to run. Red looked up, Daisy, where are you going? But he didn't leave her mother's side. Daisy ignored him and ran toward the street. Daisy, come back, she heard Aunt Sarah yell. She just kept running. Let her go, she heard her mother say as tears poured down her cheeks. I don't want her to come back ever. How could my mother say that about me? Daisy ran. Do you see the difference in the impact
mhm,
of hearing it all from Daisy's perspective in short bursts versus the long paragraph Daisy had to leave? It was she couldn't take her mom, she couldn't take seeing her mom like this, especially since it was her fault. That is a very adult perspective on what's happening. Now, if remember at the beginning,
yeah,
we talked about the difference between seeing it through Daisy's eyes as it was happening and seeing it through Daisy's eyes as an adult. If you were
mhm,
telling it as Daisy were sharing the story with someone, maybe in therapy, maybe with someone she trusts, maybe this is the first time she's telling her husband what actually happened in that moment, she
mm,
would say, I had to leave. I couldn't stand seeing my mom like that because I knew it was my fault.
mm,
That is how we process emotions from childhood as an adult versus I had to get out. Daisy had to leave. She had to get out of there. She started to run. She heard her father shout after her, "Where are you going?" But when she turned to look at him, he was next to to her mother instead of coming after. If he had come after me, maybe I would stay, right? Those immediacy of the feelings are very different than the processing of the emotions. Okay.
Mm.
So that's what you want to do through this. Anything that's very, I'm thinking through what's happening, you're going to want to remove those things and you're going to want to focus just on the actions and what she's feeling in the moment. You do a great job in this paragraph. She heard the sirens coming towards her, but she kept running. She ran up the hill as hard as she could. There's no thinking there. It's just running. This is how people process grief, right? I can't think about that. I don't want to see it. I'm just running. I'm going, right? There was a dirt parking lot filled with cars. The sirens got louder. She ran faster up the hill and she saw the ambulance pass, right? This, now she says, it turned onto her street with two police cars following behind. She grabbed her locket that Drew had given her this morning. I probably wouldn't say it turned on her street. I would probably say she saw the ambulance pass. Two police cars followed close behind. I would
Okay.
actually make it. I'm actually going to change this one. This one's easier to change. Two police cars followed behind. She didn't look back, or she just kept running. Stay in the moment. She
Mhm.
grabbed the locket that Drew had given her this morning. And then you talk a little bit about the locket and what it meant to her. It's okay because it's again um it's how she's processing what she's feeling right there. What have I done? What am I going to do? Again, very raw, very in the moment. There's no thinking involved. But
Mhm.
then you've got this noise that she starts to hear. And this noise that she starts to hear, all of this, these 5 paragraphs, take me
Mhm.
completely out of this grief that she's feeling. If you're running and
Yeah.
you're trying to get away from things, you're tuning everything out. Maybe you hear a noise and you just want to keep running away, right? And then you get to this point where she sees somebody she thinks she knows. It's Drew's friend. She remembers seeing them through her bedroom window several months ago. All of this remembering, all of this thinking doesn't happen in grief. There's no room for it. Grief, fear does the same thing. Anger does the same thing. When they start coming in, they put blinders to the rest of the world. We don't see anything else. We don't hear anything else. We don't feel anything else because they come in such heavy, heavy waves that
Mhm.
none of that is going to matter to her. And then you have this moment where she says, "Why would I use the word was?"
Yeah.
This is a very, very adult understanding, both of language and of grief. It's very common in grief scenes with adults for them to say and process was and feel the hurt and the weight of it. But that's again an adult emotion. We don't want to put adult emotions on her. We want her to feel the rawness. And the reason, Dixie, that we as readers connect so much with that kind of rawness of emotion at that teenage level is because as adults, we understand the impact that grief has on the whole rest of our lives, right?
Mhm.
It's terrible. There's a huge weight to it, but sometimes because we understand how much weight there is, the innocence of loss like this is really, really compelling for us because it takes us back to the first loss we ever experienced. And when we're seeing it as that really true emotion, it connects to us more. Now, if you were to leave this, "Why would I use the word was" in there? it, Most readers aren't going to read that and go, "No teenager would think that." But what they would do is they would now bring this teenager up a few years. in their estimation of her, right? Because we have this kind of picture of who someone is and how mature they are and how they're processing the world. So when we start seeing that, we're pulling away from the intention of the picture that you're trying to create. And that's where the authenticity of a character and the trueness of what they're experiencing becomes really important. It lets us see it in a more true way if we can use language that's more authentic to them. Does that all make sense?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay,
It's
great.
great. And this is terrible to say, but I was and I shouldn't have, I guess. I was kind of, like, trying to, like, make it a little funny, even though it was, like, such an emotional scene, and then I was trying to, like, bring a little humor into it because of the suey, pig calling is kind of,
Mm-hmm.
like, just ridiculous.
Yeah, I see what you're saying there, that sometimes we need comic relief, but it's too soon.
Mhm.
Comic relief works when we've had time to sit in grief. So think about, because we're already talking about death here, think about when people start making jokes at a funeral. Nobody walks into a funeral, shakes hands with somebody, says, I'm so sorry for your loss, and then cracks a joke, right?
Yeah.
There needs to be a reverence for the loss. We
Mm,
have to get to a place where we've all sat in the feeling long enough for somebody
mhm.
to go, okay, now is the time that we need to lighten this mood. And typically it starts with, you remember the time when, right? It tends to be that moment when, or like you're saying, somebody says something, there's a noise that we don't know or we don't understand. But the problem with this here in this moment is
It's still
it's
in the
too
middle of it.
soon, right?
Yeah.
Like we haven't
She
gotten to
hasn't
the
even
place.
seen him yet.
Right, right.
Yeah.
She's still in the place where she's trying to get away from her
Mhm.
family. She's trying to run from what it is. Nothing's going to distract her yet. So keeping it, adding this later, like as they're coming back from, they're pushing the bike back and then they hear it and they start laughing about it. Sure, that works great. But here we need to stay true to the moment of the grief and, in her case here, a little bit of terror.
I
So,
kind of in my mind was like, I don't know if if it's I thought what you thought. Is it too soon? But I I
so
didn't think about it hard enough.
I always think that when you're writing, just write it. Get it on the paper. It's much easier to come back. You are the one who put all of this story on the page. It's really easy for me to come in and be like, okay, this part of your story works. This part of your story works. But this part in here, this is taking me away from the story. That's really easy for me to say. For you to come up with this situation, that's the hard part. So I think if you're already feeling it, if this feels like something that's right that you want to happen, put it on the page, see what it feels like. If it works, fantastic. If it's close to working, you can adjust it, right? So maybe you decide that you don't want to take it out completely. Maybe you make it so, what have I done? What am I going to do? She's wiping her nose, her runny nose on her shirt, and then Sui she hears, and she ignores it at first and she keeps running, and then she hears it again, and then she hears here piggy piggy, and she's like, where there are no pigs around here. What? No, I don't have time for that. I just need to get away from here, right? Like, so these things can break in. We can have that moment of relief from grief, but she has to make a decision at this moment after she hears, hey, piggy, piggy, or here, piggy, piggy. She has to make a decision. Am I going to stay in my grief, or am I going to respond to, hey, piggy, piggy?
Mm,
In her state of mind, she's going to ignore this and she's just going to keep moving in the same way. 2 or 4 paragraphs ago, she saw the ambulance and she ignored the ambulance, right? If something is going to break her attention, the ambulance stopping. Should I go back? Should I see if they can save him? Right? That might be the thing versus hearing the neighbors scream about piggy piggy, right? Like, and
Mhm.
that's where you're going to have to choose what kind of story do you want to tell? What is she doing? But getting it on the page, that's the hard part. So, all right, let's keep going here a little bit, because the rest of the scene is the same kind of what's she processing as a child versus how we would process this as an adult. So in this moment, so she sees Drew's friend, um, who is, she thinks she's seen before, and she has this whole thought process about who he is and how like shiny and beautiful he is. And all of that is really great and a nice way to process the way like 15-year-olds process seeing boys, but she's grieving right now. She's not going to see him. She might say, oh, I know him. Drew knew him. I have to get away from him. I have to get away from everything that's associated with Drew versus leaning into all of these moments and all of these details. And
And
then,
that's why she took the motorbike because she wanted to get away from
right. And you'll
that was her
notice
thought.
that what should I do doesn't have a comment on it. How she wished Drew were here, but he couldn't be here because he was lying in their yard, maybe dead. Left that, there's no comment there. Drew's old mini bike, she walked to it quickly. Again, all of these moments that you have here are really good. It's just that these other things where she says she couldn't let him see her, she didn't want anyone to see her, she wanted to be alone. That's a very adult way to think about things, right? I can't let him see me, sure. Or I don't want anyone to see me, fine. But stringing these three thoughts right together, that's how
Mhm.
adults think. That's not how children process the world. Teenagers, that's not how they process the world, right? She felt led to the parking lot where she spotted her out. That's a very adult way of processing. This is what she would say to her therapist or her friend at 40, thinking about it, going, I got to that parking lot and something just led me there, right? And then I saw that mini bike and that was my way out. That's how adults process the world. Cut it, because as this teenager, she's rubbing on her locket and she sees Drew's old mini bike.
Mhm.
That's it. That's my ticket. She walks quickly to it. You say she's looking over her shoulder to make sure he didn't see her. Nope, she's not doing any of that. Her only thought is in her grief. She walked quickly. She got to the kickstand. The key was there, right? I might cut down on some of this. Drew showed her how to start it, how it got started. This might be a little bit more than you need, maybe not. Again, you want to keep things moving as quickly as possible. Less thought. Oh, sorry. Less thought, more action. She drove down the bumpy hill slowly, balancing with both feet, and she saw Drew's friend running towards her, right? Forget looking over her shoulder. She's looking forward. Maybe she sees him out of the corner of her eye. I want to know how she's feeling in this moment, but instead of leaning into how she's feeling, we hear more about the friend. Let's not hear about the friend yet. Let's get her on the road. You've got this great paragraph of she drove down the road, wind blowing her curls all around. Her locket bounced on her chest. She felt so free, freer than she'd ever been before she began to laugh, right? This is that moment that we're waiting for. This is the payoff of that bike, right? See how much more impactful that is when she's driving up the bumpy hill slowly. She's balancing on both feet. As she drove, the wind blew through her curls. See how much more impactful that is when they're tied together and we don't have all of this other stuff in the middle.
Yeah.
That's what we want to do. We want to pull all of that other stuff out, all of the really adult thinking, all of anything that's taking her anywhere outside of her grief. Even as the bike starts to smoke and she starts losing control, you've got this like it smells like hot grease, but not like when her mom has it on the stove. It's much worse. Again, that's like That's how we describe something that happened many years ago because we want somebody else to understand it. It's not how we experiencing it. If you want her to smell that smell, what's that smell? Ugh, ugh, what is that? Is it coming from the bike? And then she loses control, right? Like, again, it's very visceral is the word I like to use. I don't know if it's the right word, but it's like everything is happening. It's so almost tangible. We can smell it, we can taste it, we can feel it with her. We don't want to think in this moment. We only want to feel. This is the
Yeah.
difference between show and tell.
Mm.
Tell is she she smelled the grease hot like when her mother cooked on the stove, but much worse, right? That's that's telling me what it smelled like. Smelling is I started to cough because the smoke was started to choke me. It was
Mhm.
coming from the bike. I let go of the accelerator and the bike jerked up, right? She falls off the bike. And then for the second time today, the wind was knocked out of her. Again, very adult way of thinking. I just laid on the ground. I could barely breathe. Maybe I was dying too, or maybe she was dying too. Stay right in the moment. You can take the things that as an adult you wrote, they're very good, they're very important, but you want to take them out of the adult world and you want to put them in this case, the teenage world. If you're writing a scene later that has this kind of emotion where we're not processing it in the future, that's a weird thing to say. Let me say that again. This kind of editing happens a lot in these really emotional scenes. We think about emotion when we write because writing tends to be a thinking art, right? So we have a tendency, especially if we have good self-awareness and an awareness of the way we process emotions, we write things like this. And that's good because it's a great starting place. We want it, but we want to just put it through our secret decoder ring and take the thought out of it and make it the feelings. And
Mm.
that's what you want to do as you're editing a scene like this, because as you saw the places where I changed what you were writing as I was reading it, and I was pulling stuff out and I was taking stuff out of a thought and making it into an action, you could see kind of the impact differently of the two scenes. And that kind of gives you a really tangible way to make some edits when you're feeling like your scene is important, but doesn't have the emotional weight to it that maybe you're trying for.
Mm.
So
That's all
that's
great.
it's a lot.
Yeah,
So
it is a lot. I'm like, "Oh."
yeah. So what I've done is as I've gone through, I didn't make any edits. Um, because what I wanted to do is be able to help you to see the places where I was pulling away from your story, and I wanted to identify why. Because
Yeah.
you, as the author, need to make a decision about these elements to decide one, how important is this to my story in this moment? Is this something I could do later in the scene, or does it have to happen now? If it has to happen now, you want to turn it around and put it through Daisy's eyes and through Daisy's experience, knowing that her experience right now is very tunnel visioned into her grief. And the
Mhm.
reason you want to tunnel vision that into the grief is because you want your readers to feel that grief as Daisy feels that grief. So that's
Mhm.
the first part. The second part is anything that says adult thinking. These are things that she's remembering as an adult, going back to it. These are things that you can turn around and again put in her experience. Maybe you don't need them. Maybe you can just keep the scene moving by doing the things that are in between the comments. Maybe you decide you need them. But each one you're going to go through and you're going to look at it and you're going to go, how is this adding value to my reader's grief experience? If it's
Mhm.
ratcheting up the grief, then you want to leave it, but you want to put it in Daisy's voice. if it's ratcheting down the grief, if it's giving us a place to breathe a little bit instead of that
Mhm.
really overwhelming feeling that we get when grief comes crushing down on us, that's something you want to take out until you get to the place kind of like right in here where now he's coming in and she can't get away from him, because that changes things a little bit. When we're trying to escape from grief, that's our only focus. When we're cornered and we can't escape anymore, that changes things. But you want to do exactly the same thing in that second part of this after scene when she can't get away from him. You want to stay focused on her grief. Everything is through her eyes.
Mhm.
Anything he says, she's filtering it through, I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to see you. Get away from me, get away from me, get away from me, until she gets to a place where she can't and she leans into the comfort that he has to provide for her. So,
Okay, gotcha.
so great job here. You've got a lot of really, really great stuff in here. Let your reader feel that stuff and sit in it a little bit. And then I think you really got kind of a home run in here. So,
Whew, doesn't feel like it.
so
But I
it's,
appreciate it, yeah.
you know,
I know
it's
what you're saying.
it's really easy to look at an edit that has comments, comment after comment after comment after comment, and feel overwhelmed by it. The good news is there are basically two comments here. One comment is, this is adult thinking. The other
Yeah,
comment is, this is pulling me out of grief. It's
right.
not like every line, it's a different critique. It's a different, this needs to, it's this kind of the sentiment of the style that you were writing in. And again, the whole reason I asked the question in the beginning about, are you telling it in the moment or are you telling a reflection, is
Yeah,
if you're telling a reflection, those adult thinking moments are critical. You want those moments. You want her to say something like, this was the second time, it was the second time that day I got the wind knocked out of me, right? In that moment, I wanted to die,
but it's
right?
better the other way, right?
It depends on what you're doing in your story. If this were a short story that were a standalone, I would absolutely tell you or third person close that you have here, telling it from the moment that it's happening. As it
Mhm,
fits into your larger work,
mhm,
it depends on how it's serving the story. If it's serving the
mhm.
story because it's a big reveal, because she's sharing with somebody close to her this big secret that she's held onto her whole life, then processing it through as an adult makes sense. If, on the other hand, it's her trying to reconcile something that's happening in her life and she's having a flashback and she's really just remembering and reliving it, then telling it the way you have through
Yeah.
young Daisy's eyes is the way to go. So this is one of those things where as an
So what
ad,
happens is sorry, I was gonna tell you it makes sense what you're saying because what happens is she sees a picture of the football game that's laying down because she's taking her dad back with her, and he has all these, like, memorabilia stuff,
mm-hmm,
and she sees the picture. So that would make sense to do the 16-year-old
yep,
then?
yep. In that case, that's what I would do. Yep.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
And this is where working with an editor's job
That's hard
isn't,
stuff.
it's not, an editor's job is not to tell you what to fix in your story
Mhm.
or what decisions to make in your story, unless your editor is also repping your book, and then maybe the rules are different. But when you're working with a developmental editor's job is to tell you where you are and are not connecting with your readers and give
Mhm.
you suggestions on how to make those connections better so you as the author can make that decision. After this conversation, you might decide, maybe the way I was thinking it originally through her eyes isn't right. Maybe I really like this idea where I can keep these adult processing thoughts in there because I think it makes the reader connect better with the story. And that's great. That's fine. You can make that decision if that works. what you're telling me about this is a memory that's triggered because of a photograph, I think that the way you have it is right. But you have a larger story to tell, so that decision ultimately is going to be yours as the author.
Mm.
So you have a lot of power and a lot of responsibility there as the author.
I know.
Um,
I don't
but
like it. I like people to tell me what to do until I don't, right?
until you don't, right? Excellent. Well, I think you've got a great story here. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and then I'm going to turn the recording off. Thank you so much for sharing Daisy and her family with us. I appreciate it.